November 8, 1944, 14:47 hours, Hürtgen Forest near Schmidt, Germany. Hauptmann Friedrich Koller pressed himself deeper into the muddy floor of his command bunker as the earth itself seemed to come apart above him. The American artillery had been falling for exactly 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes had delivered more explosive power than his battalion had experienced in 5 years of war. Through the observation slit, he watched in disbelief as entire trees, centuries-old firs with trunks 2 meters thick, were being thrown through the air like matchsticks. His radio operator, trying to reach regimental headquarters, looked at him with eyes that reflected a new kind of terror. The frequency of impacts was impossible. German doctrine stated that sustained artillery bombardment required intervals between salvos for barrel cooling and re-aiming. Yet the American shells arrived in an unbroken stream, as if fired by a machine gun the size of a battleship. What Koller didn't know, what no amount of Wehrmacht experience could have prepared him for, was that he was experiencing a time-on-target barrage from 3 separate American artillery battalions firing variable time-fused shells, a combination of technologies that multiplied lethality far beyond simple explosive power. The mathematics were staggering. 36 guns firing 10 rounds per minute each, with every shell equipped with a miniaturized radar that detonated at the optimal height for maximum fragmentation effect. In the space of 10 minutes, his position would receive 3,600 shells, each one spreading 2,000 lethal fragments across a 50-meter radius. The Americans weren't just firing more shells than the Germans thought possible. They were making each shell exponentially more lethal through technology the Wehrmacht didn't know existed. The transformation had begun 16 months earlier in Sicily, where German artillery officers first noticed something disturbing about American fire support. The speed from target identification to shells impacting was impossibly fast. Wehrmacht doctrine required 15 to 30 minutes for a proper fire mission. Forward observers would identify targets, relay coordinates through multiple command levels, battery commanders would calculate firing solutions, and guns would be laid. The Americans seemed to compress this into 3 to 5 minutes. More disturbing still was the accuracy. First rounds landed danger close to the intended targets, something that should have required extensive registration fire. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding elements of the 21st Panzer Division in North Africa, had dismissed early reports as exaggeration. His own artillery, some of the Wehrmacht's finest, included the legendary 88mm guns that could serve as anti-aircraft, anti-tank or field artillery. German gunners were mathematically trained specialists who calculated trajectories with slide rules and extensive tables. They achieved remarkable accuracy through careful preparation and methodical fire adjustment. The idea that American artillery, operated by what German intelligence described as hastily trained civilians, could exceed German performance was ideologically impossible. But the evidence accumulated relentlessly. At Gela in Sicily, naval gunfire directed by shore parties destroyed German counterattacks with unprecedented precision. At Salerno, American artillery broke up German attacks before they could properly form. By the time of the Anzio breakout in May 1944, German commanders were reporting that American artillery responded faster than their own machine guns. Something fundamental had changed in the nature of artillery warfare, and the Wehrmacht was discovering it through brutal experience. The technological revolution began with something as mundane as a radio. The SCR-610, issued to American forward observers, weighed 38 pounds and could transmit directly to fire direction centers from 5 miles away. German artillery observers relied primarily on field telephones, requiring miles of wire that was constantly cut by shell fire. When they did have radios, they were often in higher headquarters, requiring messages to be relayed through multiple command levels. The American forward observer, often a lieutenant with 3 enlisted men, had the authority to call in the firepower of an entire artillery battalion, sometimes multiple battalions, with a single radio transmission. Captain Charles Calhoun, a forward observer with the 15th Field Artillery Battalion, described the system with matter-of-fact precision that would have stunned German counterparts. I spot a target. I radio the coordinates. Within 30 seconds, the FDC has calculated the firing solution and transmitted to the guns. First rounds are in the air within 2 minutes. If I need to adjust, I call corrections and they're implemented immediately. No committees, no authorization from higher headquarters. If I see Germans, I can have a battalion's worth of 105mm howitzers shooting at them faster than they can take cover. The Fire Direction Center itself was an American innovation that revolutionized artillery employment. Instead of each gun calculating its own firing data, a centralized center computed solutions for entire batteries simultaneously. Using graphical firing tables and specialized slide rules, FDC personnel could calculate precise firing solutions in seconds rather than minutes. More importantly, they could coordinate multiple batteries to bring devastating concentrations of fire on single targets, or spread fire across wide areas with mathematical precision. The German artillery tradition, dating back to the Prussian military reforms, emphasized precision and conservation of ammunition. Each shell was expensive, transportation was limited, and barrels wore out. German artillery doctrine stressed observed fire with careful adjustment, using the minimum rounds necessary to achieve the desired effect. A typical German battery might fire 50 rounds in a day of heavy combat, and consider that intensive expenditure. They were about to discover that Americans measured ammunition consumption by the ton rather than by the round. The first indication of American ammunition abundance came during the Italian campaign. General der Artillerie Eduard Aldinger, examining captured American positions in early 1944, found ammunition stockpiles that defied belief. Behind a single battery position, he reported, we found more shells than my entire regiment possessed. They were stacked like cordwood, thousands upon thousands, with no apparent concern for conservation. Brass casings were simply discarded in piles that would have supplied our recycling needs for months. The reality was even more staggering than Aldinger imagined. By November 1944, American artillery units in Europe were allocated ammunition on a scale that German logistics officers literally could not process. A standard American infantry division was authorized 400 tons of artillery ammunition per day for routine operations, increasing to 1,200 tons during offensives. A single American artillery battalion could fire more shells in 1 hour than a German battalion might receive in a month. The 1st Infantry Division, during 1 day of fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, fired 18,000 rounds of 105mm alone. The industrial infrastructure supporting this expenditure was beyond German comprehension. The United States produced 47 million rounds of 105mm ammunition during the war. The monthly production by 1944 exceeded 4 million rounds. Every round was manufactured to specifications that German quality control could barely achieve in laboratory conditions. Yet Americans mass-produced them on assembly lines operated by workers who had been housewives and farmers 2 years earlier. The brass cartridge cases alone required more copper than Germany's entire annual production. The explosive filling, TNT, or Composition B, was produced in quantities that would have supplied the Wehrmacht for decades. But sheer volume was only part of the equation. The variable time fuse, known as the VT or proximity fuse, represented a technological leap that multiplied artillery lethality beyond German understanding. Developed in absolute secrecy by American and British scientists, the VT fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver that detected the ground or target and detonated the shell at the optimal height for maximum effect. Against personnel in the open, a VT-fused shell was 5 to 10 times more lethal than a conventional point-detonating or time-fused shell. Major Klaus Becker, an artillery specialist who survived the Hürtgen Forest, later testified about his first encounter with VT-fused shells. We knew about airbursts, of course. Our own artillery used time fuses when we could calculate them properly. But these American shells were different. They exploded at exactly the right height every time, about 10 meters above ground. In forest fighting, where we thought trees would provide protection, it was catastrophic. The shells detonated in the treetops, sending fragments and wood splinters downward in a cone of death. Foxholes offered no protection. Bunker roofs were penetrated. Men simply disappeared. The German command structure initially refused to believe reports about VT fuses. When captured documents mentioned proximity fuses, German intelligence dismissed them as propaganda or misunderstanding. The idea that Americans had miniaturized radar into an artillery shell was deemed technically impossible. German scientists had been working on similar concepts, but considered them decades from practical implementation. The Wehrmacht's Technical Intelligence Service issued a report in September 1944, stating categorically that proximity fuses were beyond current technical capabilities of any nation. Meanwhile, American artillery was achieving results that defied conventional military science. Time-on-target missions, where multiple batteries timed their fire so all shells arrived simultaneously, delivered devastating psychological and physical effects. German soldiers reported that the world would simply explode without warning. There was no whistle of incoming shells building gradually, no opportunity to take cover. One moment was calm, the next was annihilation. A TOT mission from a single artillery battalion could place 108 shells on target in the span of 2 seconds. When multiple battalions participated, the effect was apocalyptic. Lieutenant Heinrich Böll, who would later become a Nobel Prize-winning author, described experiencing American artillery in the Hürtgen forest. It was not warfare as we understood it. It was industrialized destruction. The shells came without pause, without pattern, without mercy. We counted the impacts at first, 10, 20, 50, 100. Then we stopped counting and simply tried to merge with the earth. Men went mad. Hardened veterans who had survived Russia would break completely. The trees above us exploded in sequence like a giant walking through the forest and crushing everything. When it finally stopped, half my company had ceased to exist. The psychological impact was carefully calculated. American artillery doctrine emphasized that firepower was cheaper than blood. Why send infantry to assault a position when artillery could obliterate it? This philosophy, impossible for ammunition-constrained German forces, meant that American commanders would routinely expend thousands of shells to save dozens of lives. A suspected German machine gun position might receive 500 rounds. A small village hiding German forces could absorb 10,000 shells in an afternoon. The expenditure rates broke German understanding of military economy. General der Infanterie Baptist Cagnes, commanding the 85th Infantry Division, captured the German bewilderment in a December 1944 report. The enemy employs artillery as we employ machine guns. Where we calculate each shot, they saturate. Where we use a battery, they use a battalion. Where we fire for minutes, they fire for hours. Our own excellent artillery is overwhelmed not by superior skill, but by incomprehensible abundance. They do not aim to destroy specific targets, but to delete entire map coordinates. The abundance extended beyond mere shells. American artillery units received new gun tubes when bore wear affected accuracy, typically after 3,000 rounds. German batteries nursed worn barrels far beyond their effective life because replacements didn't exist. American guns fired so frequently that they developed specialized cooling procedures, with water cans and wet blankets to prevent overheating. German doctrine assumed guns would never fire rapidly enough to require such measures. Americans had specialized ammunition for every purpose: high explosive, white phosphorus, smoke, illumination, propaganda leaflets, and even shells that distributed medical supplies to surrounded friendly forces. The integration of artillery with other arms achieved levels of coordination that German combined arms doctrine, despite its sophistication, couldn't match. Every American infantry company commander could call for artillery support through his forward observer. Tank platoons had artillery observers attached. Even individual reconnaissance patrols could request and receive fire missions. The Germans, accustomed to artillery being controlled at division or corps level, found themselves facing a situation where every American unit down to platoon level could summon devastating firepower within minutes. Staff Sergeant William Carey, a forward observer with the 29th Infantry Division, recorded in his diary the routine nature of American fire support. This morning we called in 3 fire missions before breakfast. First, interdiction fire on a crossroads to prevent German movement. Second, counter-battery fire on a suspected German mortar position. Third, harassment fire on a wood line where Germans might be hiding. Total rounds expended, approximately 400. German response, nothing. They're either destroyed, out of ammunition, or too scared to reveal their positions. This is a typical morning. The German artillery, despite its technical excellence and skilled crews, found itself paralyzed by American counter-battery fire. The moment German guns opened fire, American sound-ranging equipment and flash-spotting teams pinpointed their location. Within minutes, American counter-battery fire would saturate the German gun positions. German artillerymen learned to shoot and relocate immediately, abandoning the careful registration and adjustment that made their fire accurate. This shoot-and-scoot approach preserved the guns but eliminated their effectiveness. Oberleutnant Werner Hartmann, a battery commander in the 116th Panzer Division, described the impossible situation. We had 4 105mm howitzers, excellent weapons, well maintained, with experienced crews. But we received perhaps 100 rounds per week, sometimes less. The Americans would fire that many rounds at a single target. When we did fire, within 3 minutes, American counter-battery fire would arrive. Not harassment fire, but concentrated bombardment from multiple battalions. We lost more guns to American artillery than to any other cause. The disparity in ammunition supply created cascading tactical effects. German infantry, knowing artillery support was minimal, had to assault positions with rifles and grenades that Americans could destroy with high explosives. German tanks, unable to rely on artillery preparation, had to expose themselves to American anti-tank weapons. German defensive positions, unable to break up American attacks with artillery, faced overwhelming infantry and tank assaults preceded by hours of bombardment. Every aspect of German tactical doctrine, refined through years of combat, collapsed when artillery support effectively didn't exist. The Hürtgen Forest battle provided the most extreme demonstration of American artillery dominance. In this dense woodland, where tanks couldn't operate and infantry combat occurred at ranges of meters, artillery became the decisive arm. The forest canopy, which Germans expected would provide protection, became a multiplier of American lethality. Tree bursts from VT-fused shells created a rain of metal and wood fragments that no cover could deflect. German bunkers, carefully constructed with overhead cover, were penetrated by the sheer volume of fire. Positions that had held for weeks would simply cease to exist after an American bombardment. Major Gerhard Engel, former Wehrmacht liaison officer to Hitler, witnessed the destruction of an entire regiment in the Hürtgen Forest. The 275th Infantry Regiment, 3,000 veteran soldiers, was deleted by American artillery in 72 hours. Not defeated, not forced to retreat, but deleted. When we tried to relieve them, we found no organized units, just scattered, shocked survivors. The regimental command post, a reinforced concrete bunker, had taken over 500 direct hits. The roof was gone, the walls were rubble, the staff was buried. This was not combat, it was extermination by high explosive. The American artillery's effectiveness was multiplied by innovations in fire control that German observers found almost miraculous. The use of aircraft observers directing artillery fire gave Americans a god's-eye view of the battlefield. Light observation aircraft like the L-4 Grasshopper could orbit over German positions for hours. their pilots talking directly to fire direction centers. German attempts to shoot down these aircraft were futile. They flew too low for heavy anti-aircraft guns and too high for small arms. The psychological effect of knowing that an American observer was circling overhead, capable of bringing down tons of high explosive at will, paralyzed German movement. Captain Robert Powell, piloting an L-4 over the Siegfried Line, described the experience. "I could see everything, every bunker, every trench, every movement. I'd spot a group of Germans moving and call it in. Within 2 minutes the area would erupt. I'd adjust fire, walking the shells across German positions like using a garden hose. In one afternoon, I directed fire that destroyed 6 machine gun positions, 2 mortar teams, and an entire company trying to counterattack. The Germans must have felt like they were fighting an invisible giant who could see everything and strike anywhere." The integration of technology extended to every aspect of American artillery operations. The M12 gun motor carriage mounted a 155mm gun on a tracked chassis, providing heavy artillery with mobility that German towed guns couldn't match. The M7 Priest self-propelled 105mm howitzer could keep pace with advancing armor, providing immediate fire support. The multiple-gun motor carriage M16 with 4.50 caliber machine guns provided air defense that made German ground attack aircraft suicidal. Every element was mechanized, motorized, and integrated into a system that operated with industrial efficiency. The German response to American artillery superiority progressed through stages of denial, adaptation, and eventual despair. Initial reports were dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. Field commanders who reported American ammunition expenditures were accused of defeatism or making excuses for their own failures. Hitler himself, when informed that Americans had fired 20,000 shells in a single day at one division, declared it impossible and ordered the reporting officer arrested for spreading enemy propaganda. The Wehrmacht's high command, isolated in East Prussia and fed filtered information, continued planning operations based on artillery parity that hadn't existed since 1943. As reality became undeniable, German forces attempted adaptation. The construction of deeper bunkers consumed enormous resources but provided only marginal protection against the volume of American fire. Dispersal tactics reduced casualties, but also reduced combat effectiveness. Night movement avoided observed artillery fire, but slowed operations to a crawl. Every adaptation imposed costs that accumulated into paralysis. German units that had maneuvered boldly across Europe found themselves cowering in holes, moving only in darkness, afraid to concentrate for attacks because concentration meant annihilation. General Major Rudolf von Gersdorff, Chief of Staff for the German 7th Army, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "By late 1944, American artillery had become our primary concern in all planning. Not their tanks, not their infantry, but their artillery. We would identify American positions and plan attacks only to have those positions erased by artillery before we could move. We would prepare defensive lines only to have them obliterated before American attacks. We stopped thinking in terms of defeating American forces and began thinking only of surviving American artillery." The proximity fuse revelation came gradually and horrifyingly. German intelligence first noticed that American anti-aircraft fire had become devastatingly effective, shooting down aircraft at rates that defied probability. The same technology applied to field artillery multiplied its lethality against ground targets. German medical officers reported a change in wound patterns, more head and shoulder injuries from overhead bursts, multiple fragment wounds from optimal detonation heights, casualties in positions that should have been protected. The realization that Americans had achieved what German scientists considered impossible added a technological despair to material inadequacy. Dr. Friedrich Paulus, not to be confused with the Field Marshal, was a German physicist who examined captured American VT fuses in January 1945. His report to the Wehrmacht Weapons Office was stark. The Americans have miniaturized a radar system into a shell fuse. The technology involves sub-miniature vacuum tubes that survive acceleration of 20,000 times gravity. The manufacturing precision required exceeds our capabilities, even in laboratory conditions. That they are mass-producing these devices, millions of them, indicates a technological industrial capability we cannot match. I estimate we are 10 years behind, perhaps more. The American production statistics for VT fuses alone told a story of industrial supremacy that dwarfed German capabilities. By war's end, American factories had produced 22 million proximity fuses. Each one contained 4 sub-miniature vacuum tubes, meaning 88 million tubes manufactured to specifications that German industry couldn't achieve for single units. The cost per fuse was $20, at a time when a complete rifle cost $30. Americans were putting the equivalent of a radio in every shell, throwing sophisticated electronics at targets like they were rocks. The industrial arithmetic was incomprehensible to German planners accustomed to scarcity. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the ultimate demonstration of American artillery dominance. The German offensive, their last major operation in the West, initially achieved surprise and success. But as American forces recovered from the initial shock, their artillery began its work. At Bastogne, surrounded American forces held out largely because their artillery, despite ammunition shortages, remained devastatingly effective. Every German attack was met with concentrated fire that turned assault forces into casualties before they could close with American positions. Hauptmann Otto Hitzfeld, commanding a battalion in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacking Bastogne, reported, "We attacked with 600 men at dawn. American artillery began falling immediately, not random fire, but precisely aimed concentrations that followed our movements. When we tried to concentrate for assault, the fire intensified. When we dispersed, it followed us. By noon, I had 150 men left. We had advanced 500 meters. The Americans had fired an estimated 2,000 shells at my battalion alone. We could not even see their positions." The American artillery's ability to mass fires from multiple units created kill zones that nothing could survive. During one German attack near St. Vith, 18 American artillery battalions, over 200 guns, fired simultaneously at a 1,000-meter square area. In the space of 5 minutes, over 3,000 shells landed in an area the size of several city blocks. German survivors, those few who remained sane, reported that the earth itself seemed to boil. The very air became lethal as overpressure from hundreds of simultaneous explosions created blast waves that killed without leaving marks. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, whose Kampfgruppe spearheaded the German offensive, encountered American artillery at Stoumont. His elite SS troops, veterans of the Eastern Front, where they had faced massive Soviet bombardments, were stopped cold by American firepower. The Americans' artillery was unlike anything we had experienced, even from the Russians. The Russians fired more shells, but randomly, wastefully. The Americans fired with precision, concentration, and timing that achieved maximum effect. Every shell seemed aimed. Every barrage had a purpose. They turned artillery from a support weapon into the primary killing mechanism. The technological superiority extended beyond the weapons themselves to the entire fire support system. American meteorological sections provided weather data that improved accuracy. Survey teams established precise coordinates for every battery position. Communication networks linked observers, fire direction centers, and guns with redundant radio and wire systems. Ammunition supply operated with factory-like efficiency, with shells moving from ships to guns in an unbroken chain. Every element was optimized, standardized, and integrated in ways German forces could only dream about. Captain James Barlow, a fire direction officer with the 30th Infantry Division, described the systematic nature of American artillery. "We had procedures for everything. Harassment and interdiction fire followed schedules. Preparation fires preceded every attack. Defensive fires were pre-planned and triggered by coded signals. Counter-battery programs ran automatically whenever enemy guns were detected. We turned artillery into an industrial process. The Germans were still treating it as a craft. We mass-produced death while they handcrafted it. The psychological impact on German forces was documented in letters, diaries, and medical reports. Artillery neurosis, what would later be called combat stress reaction, reached epidemic proportions in units facing sustained American bombardment. Veterans who had endured years of combat on the Eastern Front broke under American artillery. The constant threat, the inability to respond, the sheer helplessness of watching tons of explosives fall like rain, shattered morale more effectively than any propaganda could achieve. Gefreiter Helmut Göring wrote to his wife in December 1944, "The Americans have guns everywhere. They fire all day and all night. We cannot move, cannot eat, cannot sleep. The shells come without warning, hundreds at a time. Men disappear, not killed, but vaporized. Nothing remains. We pray for fog, so their observers cannot see us. We pray for rain to slow their movements. We pray, but their shells keep falling. I have been at war for 4 years. I have never been so afraid." The German medical services, overwhelmed by casualties, documented the changing nature of wounds. Traditional battlefield injuries, rifle bullets, shell fragments from exploding rounds, were replaced by massive trauma from proximity-fused shells. Multiple fragment wounds, traumatic amputations, and blast injuries became the norm. German field hospitals, already short of supplies, couldn't cope with casualties that required complex surgery. The wounded often died not from their initial injuries, but from the inability to provide adequate treatment. Oberstarzt Dr. Wilhelm Bitter, chief surgeon for the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, reported, "In Russia, we could save 60% of wounded who reached our aid stations. Against American artillery, the rate dropped to 30%. The wounds are more severe, more complex, more multiple. Men arrive with dozens of fragment wounds, blast damage to internal organs, traumatic amputations. We lack blood, antibiotics, even bandages. The Americans wound more severely and in greater numbers than we can treat. Their artillery is a medical catastrophe as much as a military one." The disparity in artillery capability created a cascade of tactical and operational consequences. German attacks, lacking adequate artillery preparation, failed with heavy casualties. German defenses, unable to break up American attacks with firepower, were overwhelmed by combined arms assaults. German movements, constantly under observation and fire, slowed to a crawl. The Wehrmacht, which had pioneered mobile warfare, found itself immobilized by American firepower. Every principle of German military art was negated by simple inability to match American artillery. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, issued a desperate order in January 1945. "All commanders will husband artillery ammunition as our most precious resource. Expenditure of more than 10 rounds requires divisional approval. Battery positions will be changed after every fire mission. Gun crews will dig positions to maximum depth. These measures are acknowledgement that we cannot match enemy firepower and must preserve what little we have." This order from the Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe was an admission of utter defeat in the artillery war. The American artillery advantage accelerated through 1945 as German capability collapsed entirely. Ammunition factories were bombed, transportation networks destroyed, and fuel for moving guns became non-existent. German batteries that had fired dozens of rounds daily now fired single shots weekly. Meanwhile, American production continued to increase. Monthly shell production reached 5 million rounds. New weapons like the 8-inch howitzer and 240mm howitzer were introduced. The M65 atomic cannon was in development, though the war ended before its deployment. The final campaigns in Germany demonstrated artillery dominance taken to its logical extreme. Entire cities were deleted by American firepower before infantry entered. The ancient city of Jülich was so thoroughly destroyed by artillery that aerial observers couldn't identify where streets had been. German surrender negotiations often began with the phrase, "We cannot withstand your artillery." The Wehrmacht, which had begun the war with superior guns and doctrine, ended it cowering in cellars while American shells turned their country to rubble. General der Artillerie Karl Toholter, inspector of artillery for the Wehrmacht, wrote in his final report, "The Americans redefined artillery warfare. They transformed it from a supporting arm to the dominant weapon system. Their technological innovations, proximity fuses, fire direction centers, forward observers with radios, were important, but not decisive. What was decisive was their ability to produce and deliver unlimited ammunition. They fired in a day what we fired in a month. They fired at single soldiers what we would fire at battalions. They violated every principle of economy and efficiency, and in doing so, they achieved total superiority." The statistics of American artillery in World War II Europe tell a story of industrial warfare that exceeded German comprehension. Total rounds fired 65 million in European theatre. Peak daily expenditure 500,000 rounds on April 16, 1945. Average divisional daily expenditure 2,000 tons of ammunition. Ratio of American to German ammunition expenditure 50 to 1 by 1945. Number of artillery pieces 35,000 in Europe by May 1945. Proximity fused shells fired 10 million in Europe. Time from target identification to rounds on target 3 to 5 minutes average. Percentage of American casualties from enemy artillery 15%. Percentage of German casualties from American artillery 65%. The human cost was staggering. German military medical records, those that survived, indicate that over 2 million German soldiers were wounded by American artillery in Western Europe. Of these, an estimated 400,000 died from their wounds. Entire divisions were eliminated not through maneuver or assault, but through systematic bombardment. The Wehrmacht lost more men to American artillery in 1 year than it had lost to all causes in the first 2 years of the war. But beyond the statistics lay a fundamental transformation in warfare. Artillery had evolved from a supporting weapon to the primary killing mechanism. The Americans hadn't achieved this through superior tactics or better training, but through industrial production applied to military problems. They built more guns, produced more shells, developed better technology, and created systems that could deliver unprecedented firepower with minimal delay. They proved that in industrial warfare, the side that can produce and deliver the most explosives wins. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, creator of German armored warfare doctrine, offered perhaps the most insightful analysis. "We prepared for a war of movement and maneuver, where skill and courage would prove decisive. The Americans fought a war of material and firepower, where production and logistics proved decisive. We thought war was an art. They proved it was an industrial process. Their artillery was not 50 times more lethal because each shell was 50 times more powerful, but because they fired 50 times more shells with technology we didn't possess at targets we couldn't protect." The German soldiers who faced American artillery learned truths that their high command refused to accept until too late. That courage meant nothing against proximity-fused shells exploding overhead. That tactical brilliance was irrelevant when entire grid squares could be deleted by massed fires. That defensive positions were death traps when the enemy could afford to fire 1,000 shells at every bunker. That the war was lost, not when American soldiers crossed the Rhine, but when American factories started producing millions of shells monthly. In May 1945, as Germany surrendered unconditionally, Wehrmacht officers surveyed the devastation wrought primarily by American artillery. Ancient cities lay in ruins. Entire forests had been reduced to splintered stumps. The landscape of Western Germany was cratered like the moon. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, provided the final verdict. The Americans did not defeat us in battle. They obliterated us with artillery. They proved that in modern war, firepower is everything and everything else is secondary. We learned this lesson amid the ruins of our country, written in the blood of our soldiers, demonstrated by millions of tons of American high explosive. The legacy of American artillery superiority in World War II extends far beyond that conflict. It established principles that dominate military thinking to this day, that firepower is cheaper than blood, that industrial capacity determines military capability, that technology can multiply lethality beyond linear calculation. The Gulf War's steel rain of precision munitions, the shock and awe of Iraq, the GPS-guided artillery rounds of today, all trace their lineage to the moment German forces discovered that American artillery was not just quantitatively superior, but qualitatively revolutionary. Hauptmann Friedrich Koller, who had pressed himself into the mud of his bunker that November day in the Hürtgen forest, survived the war. In a 1975 interview, he reflected on his experience. "We entered the war believing that German military skill would overcome American material advantage. We discovered that American material advantage was so overwhelming that skill became irrelevant. Their artillery taught us that modern war is not about tactics or strategy, but about the industrial capacity to deliver explosives. They could afford to be wasteful, imprecise, excessive. We had to be perfect, and perfection was not enough against their abundance." The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. When German forces met American artillery, they discovered it was not marginally superior, not twice or 10 times more lethal, but 50 times more devastating than their doctrine, their experience, and their imagination had prepared them for. This wasn't because American shells were 50 times more powerful or American gunners 50 times more skilled. It was because America could produce 50 times more shells, deliver them 50 times faster, and employ technology that multiplied their lethality beyond German comprehension. The Wehrmacht met American artillery and discovered that they weren't fighting an army, but an entire industrial civilization that had transformed war from a contest of warriors into a problem of production and delivery. The final testimony comes from an unnamed German soldier's diary found in the ruins of Aachen. "The Americans do not fight wars. They administer death through artillery. We faced not soldiers, but factories. Every shell that falls carries with it the weight of Detroit, Pittsburgh, Birmingham. We are not being defeated, we are being processed like raw material in their factories, reduced to casualties by industrial efficiency. This is not war as our fathers knew it. This is extermination by high explosive measured in tons per day, delivered with the same precision they build automobiles. We never had a chance." The transformation of warfare that American artillery represented extended into every aspect of ground combat. German infantry tactics, refined through 5 years of combat, depended on fire and movement with organic support weapons. Machine guns would suppress, mortars would neutralize strong points, and infantry would assault. This combined arms approach had conquered most of Europe. Against American forces, it became suicidal. The moment German infantry concentrated for attack, forward observers called in artillery. The moment machine guns opened fire, counter-battery radar pinpointed their positions. The moment mortars fired, sound-ranging equipment triangulated their location. Every aggressive action triggered overwhelming response. Feldwebel Ernst Zimmermann, a veteran of Poland, France, Russia, and Italy, described the paralysis. "In Russia, we could fight. The enemy had more men, more tanks, but we could outmaneuver them, outthink them. Against the Americans, there was nothing to outthink. They didn't maneuver, they deleted grid squares. We would identify a weak point in their line and concentrate to exploit it. Before we could attack, the position would be buried under thousands of shells. Not hundreds, thousands. They knew we were coming because their observation planes saw everything, and their response was always the same: complete annihilation by high explosive." The American approach to defensive warfare was equally revolutionary. German doctrine emphasized elastic defense, allowing enemy penetration, then counter-attacking to restore the line. This required careful husbanding of reserves and precise timing. American doctrine was simpler. Whenever Germans concentrated, delete them with artillery. No need for complex maneuvers or carefully timed counterattacks. Just overwhelming firepower delivered immediately. German attacks didn't fail because American infantry stopped them. They failed because American artillery erased them before they could properly begin. Colonel William de Saubry, commanding the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion at Bastogne, explained the American philosophy. Why risk my men in close combat when artillery can do the job? German attacks followed patterns: preliminary bombardment, then infantry assault, possibly with tank support. The moment their bombardment lifted, I called for artillery on their forming up areas. By the time their infantry advanced, half were already casualties. The survivors walked into our final protective fires. We broke entire regiments without my riflemen firing more than a few shots. This wasn't courage or cowardice. It was simple mathematics. Shells are cheaper than soldiers. The weather dependency that should have limited artillery effectiveness became another demonstration of American technological superiority. German artillery required visual observation for accuracy, meaning fog, rain, or darkness severely degraded their effectiveness. American artillery used map firing, sound ranging, radar direction, and forward observers with radio sets. Weather that grounded observation aircraft simply meant switching to ground observers or firing by map coordinates. Time on target missions could be calculated and executed in complete darkness with the same accuracy as broad daylight. During the brutal winter of 1944-45, when temperatures dropped below -20°C and snowdrifts made movement nearly impossible, American artillery continued its relentless program. Guns were fitted with special cold-weather lubricants developed by petroleum scientists. Shells were stored in heated bunkers to maintain consistent propellant temperatures. Crews worked in shifts to prevent frostbite while maintaining fire rates. German forces, meanwhile, found their guns frozen, their ammunition unreliable in extreme cold, their horses dying from exposure. The weather that should have equalized the battlefield only emphasized American material superiority. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite formations, described encountering American artillery during the Normandy campaign. We were not a division fighting another division. We were a division fighting an entire industrial system. Their artillery never stopped, never slowed, never ran short. Day and night, fair weather and foul, they fired. We counted once. In a single hour, my division received over 4,000 shells. Not in a day, in an hour. My veterans of Kursk, where Soviet artillery had been massive, said the Americans were worse. The Soviets fired more shells, but randomly. The Americans fired fewer, but with precision that made each shell count. The integration of artillery with air power created a synergy that multiplied American lethality beyond simple addition. Fighter bombers would attack German positions, forcing them to disperse. Artillery would then catch them in the open, or artillery would force Germans into bunkers, where fighter bombers would destroy them with direct hits. The coordination between air and ground fire support was seamless, enabled by forward air controllers and artillery observers working side by side, often in the same observation post talking to aircraft and artillery simultaneously. Major Hans von Luck, whose combat memoirs became essential reading for understanding German experiences, wrote, "The Americans had created something new in warfare, a fire support system that operated like a living organism. Every part communicated with every other part instantly. Aircraft spotted for artillery. Artillery suppressed flak for aircraft. Infantry identified targets for both. It was not coordination in the traditional sense, but integration at a level we never achieved. You could not fight one element without triggering response from all elements." The American logistics system supporting this artillery dominance was itself a marvel that German officers studied with disbelief. The Red Ball Express and its successor operations delivered ammunition on a scale that redefined military supply. A single ammunition truck company could move 300 tons daily. A typical infantry division in combat required 400 tons of supplies daily, of which 300 tons was ammunition. The supply system was so efficient that American units frequently had more ammunition than they could physically store, leading to the practice of dumping, firing excess ammunition at suspected target areas rather than storing it. Oberst Hermann Balck, considered one of the Wehrmacht's most talented tacticians, observed, "The Americans had industrialized not just production, but consumption. They fired artillery like a factory consumes raw materials, continuously, systematically, without concern for waste. We observed them firing harassment missions at empty crossroads just to use up ammunition before new supplies arrived. They would expend 100 shells to destroy a single machine gun that we would have assaulted with infantry. This was not military inefficiency, but industrial logic applied to warfare. The proximity fuse remained the most closely guarded American secret until late in the war. German intelligence knew something had changed in American anti-aircraft effectiveness. The kill rate against V-1 flying bombs over England jumped from 24% to 79% when proximity fuses were introduced, but the application to field artillery was not confirmed until German forces captured intact VT fuses in the Ardennes. The technical examination revealed miniaturization that German scientists hadn't achieved in laboratory conditions, mass-produced at rates of millions per month. Professor Hubert Schardin, Germany's leading ballistician, examined captured proximity fuses and reported, "The Americans have achieved in production what we considered theoretical. Each fuse contains technology equivalent to a military radio set, miniaturized to fit in a shell, robust enough to survive 20,000 G acceleration, sensitive enough to detect targets at optimal burst distance, and cheap enough to use in routine bombardment. The industrial infrastructure required to produce these devices exceeds our entire electronics industry. We are not behind by years, but by generations." The human dimension of facing American artillery was captured in thousands of letters that never reached their destinations, intercepted by American intelligence or found on casualties. Young German soldiers, many just teenagers by 1945, wrote of experiences that would have seemed like fantasy to their fathers who fought in World War I. Grenadier Wilhelm Hoffmann, age 17, wrote his final letter, "Mother, the Americans have guns that think. The shells know where to explode. They burst in the trees above us, sending death downward where we cannot hide. They see us from invisible planes and punish every movement with tons of explosive. We do not fight. We simply endure until we die or surrender. I have not seen an American soldier, only felt their shells. If this letter reaches you, know that I faced not enemies, but machines, and machines do not care about courage." The operational level impact was documented by German staff officers trying to maintain coherent defense. Traditional defensive doctrine required reserves positioned to counterattack penetrations, but reserves concentrated for counterattack were immediately detected and destroyed by artillery. Dispersed reserves couldn't concentrate fast enough to be effective. Command posts, traditionally located close enough to control battles, were systematically targeted by American artillery whenever radio traffic indicated their location. The Wehrmacht's command and control system, dependent on centralized decision-making, collapsed under precision bombardment. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach reported, "Command became impossible. Every order transmitted by radio triggered artillery response. Every concentration of vehicles drew immediate bombardment. Every command post identified was destroyed within hours. We were reduced to written orders carried by messenger, decisions made by junior officers without coordination, defense conducted by isolated units without mutual support. The Americans had not just superior firepower, but the ability to apply it instantly wherever we showed organization. They turned our strength, disciplined command structure, into vulnerability." By March 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine, German artillery had essentially ceased to exist as an effective force. Many batteries had guns but no ammunition. Others had ammunition but no fuel to move guns. Those with both guns and ammunition lacked trained crews, most experienced gunners being dead or captured. American artillery, meanwhile, was reaching its peak effectiveness. New weapons, improved ammunition, and refined techniques made every shell more lethal. The final campaigns weren't battles but execution by high explosive, with German forces helpless to respond. The crossing of the Rhine demonstrated American artillery at its zenith. In preparation for the assault crossing at Remagen, American guns fired 65,000 shells in 6 hours. Not at specific targets, but at grid squares, systematically deleting defensive positions whether occupied or not. German reserves moving to counterattack were caught in open by interdiction fires that had been pre-planned days in advance. The famous Ludendorff Bridge, captured intact, was protected by an umbrella of artillery fire so dense that German attempts to destroy it, including Frogmen, jet bombers, and V-2 rockets, all failed under the protective barrage. General Major Karl Wagner, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Model, provided the epitaph for German artillery. "We began the war with superior guns, superior doctrine, superior training. We ended it hiding from American shells we couldn't match, fired in quantities we couldn't conceive, directed by technology we couldn't understand, supplied by logistics we couldn't interrupt." The Americans proved that in industrial war, the side that can deliver the most explosive wins. Everything else, courage, skill, experience, is secondary to simple ability to fire more shells faster and more accurately than the enemy. The captured German documents revealed desperate attempts to understand and counter American artillery superiority, studies of shell crater patterns trying to determine battery locations, analysis of timing between observation aircraft appearance and bombardment, detailed logs of ammunition expenditure trying to find patterns of shortage. All failed to find weakness because American artillery operated on principles of abundance that made German analytical frameworks obsolete. They looked for weak points in a system that had none because it could afford redundancy at every level. Major Karl Thoholte, son of the Inspector of Artillery, served as a liaison officer trying to coordinate German artillery response. His diary, recovered after his death in April 1945, chronicled the dissolution. January. "We have 50 rounds per gun per day. Americans fire 50 rounds per gun per hour. February, reduced to 20 rounds per day. Americans increased to sustained bombardment lasting hours. March, 10 rounds per day, sometimes none. Americans fire preparation barrages using more shells than we've received all month. April, we have no ammunition. Americans are firing at individual soldiers. The war is over. It has been over since we realized they could waste more than we could save." The statistical summary of American artillery superiority, compiled by the U.S. Army's Operations Research Office after the war, quantified what German forces experienced. Daily shell consumption rates. American forces averaged 250,000 shells per day in active operations. German forces averaged 5,000 shells per day by late 1944. A ratio of 50 to 1. Time from target identification to rounds on target. American average 3 to 5 minutes. German average 15 to 30 minutes when possible at all. Percentage of casualties caused by artillery. German casualties from American artillery 58.5%. American casualties from German artillery 12.3%. Ammunition availability. American units regularly exceeded authorized ammunition allowances by 200%. German units operated at 10 to 20% of authorized allowances. The truth that emerged from the ruins of Germany was that American artillery hadn't just been superior, it had redefined what artillery meant in modern warfare. It transformed from a supporting arm to the primary killing mechanism, from a scarce resource carefully rationed to an abundant commodity freely expended, from a weapon requiring skill to employ to an industrial process requiring only targets to service. The German army that had invented modern combined arms warfare was destroyed by American artillery that turned warfare into an industrial process where victory belonged to whoever could deliver the most high explosive most quickly. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, signing Germany's unconditional surrender, reportedly said, "We knew we were finished when we realized American artillery was limited only by the number of targets they could find, not by shells, not by guns, not by anything we understood as constraints. They had made warfare into manufacturing, and they could manufacture death faster than we could absorb it." The legacy lives in modern military doctrine that prioritizes firepower over maneuver, precision over mass, and industrial capacity over warrior skill. Every GPS-guided shell, every MLRS rocket, every precision munition traces its heritage to the moment German forces met American artillery and discovered it was not 5 or 10 but 50 times more lethal than anything their experience, doctrine, or imagination had prepared them for. They had prepared for war as they knew it. They met instead the arsenal of democracy delivering high explosive at industrial scale, and they were not defeated but processed, reduced to casualties by the tens of thousands, deleted from existence by the grid square. In the end, American artillery proved that in the age of industrial warfare, the side that can produce and deliver the most explosive force wins, regardless of tactics, courage, or experience. The German Wehrmacht, perhaps history's most professionally competent military force, was not outfought but outproduced, not outmaneuvered but outgunned, not defeated in detail but erased wholesale by American artillery that redefined what military firepower meant. They met American artillery expecting superiority of perhaps double or triple. They discovered instead a disparity so vast that it changed not just the outcome of battles, but the very nature of war itself.